Right away with this
That camera.
over.
It's gotta go even more, or could go like right
Yeah.
here. Yeah. Cool.
Is that okay?
Yeah, nice.
It's just a little bit.
Sorry guys, we have these two reserved. Speakers, but
What's your estimate of how big the online audience is?
it's been anywhere between 18 and 30 for the other two
Small,
events.
small.
It's currently 7 waiting.
Okay.
She's
Small.
listening to us right now. You can say hello.
Well, that's okay.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Watusi nations. Thank you to SALA, and in particular Ron Collette and Leslie Van Duzer for their ongoing support. And most importantly, thank you to the Inform staff for doing a great job organizing these events. And most importantly, thank you to all of you joining us this evening. Appreciate it. And on that note, I'll hand the mic off to Ron.
So thank you so much. I've already been at least introduced on a first name basis to most of you. So I'm Ron Callett, and I'm Director of the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, and I'm not speaking into the microphone probably, at the University of British Columbia. So welcome to this presentation and conversation with my faculty colleague Matthew Souls, all about his new book, Icebergs, Zombies, and the Ultra Thin, Architecture and Capitalism in the 21st Century. This is SALA's third faculty book launch this month. I guess the bright side of the last year and a half has been a surge of productivity among faculty book writers. So it's one bright spot, otherwise not very bright, 18 months or so. So not coincidentally, this is our third opportunity to meet and mingle with friends, colleagues and the public at Inform, the last 2 Wednesdays, including this one. So thank you to our gracious and generous hosts, Nancy Mills and their colleagues at Inform. We are very appreciative of this. It's been a great relationship and we really enjoy coming down there. Since at least the Renaissance, architecture, real estate, and capital have been entangled in many and complicated ways. Ultra-thin architecture and capitalism in the 21st century unpacks and reveals these relationships and interactions for our global times. Peggy Deemer, architect, professor emerita at Yale University and author of the 2013 book, Architecture and Capitalism, 1845 to the Present, now updated, who really likes Matthew's book, captured its sense in this really wonderfully on-point quote. The dissection of the complex but very material nature of finance capital, the adroit linking of real estate calculations to the physical shape of housing, the exposure of how, in architecture, base, the money equation, and superstructure, architectural aspiration, are dialectically intertwined. The weaving of cultural and economic theory with concrete facts. I think ultimately, Matthew reminds us that, like the goldfish asking, what water? Architecture's inability to comprehend its submersion in finance capital dooms both our urban life and our architectural reputation. I know Matthew quite well, and he is sharp, provocative, and well-spoken thinker and writer. We can look forward to an insightful and provocative unpacking of these ideas and examples of them at the heart of his book. Not surprisingly, Professor Deemer is but one of many fans. The media attention and impact of Icebergs, Zombies, and the Ultra Thin has been extraordinary. Published just over 6 months ago, at last count, Monday, Matthew and Icebergs, Zombies, and the Ultra Thin have enjoyed book launches at Cooper Union, Harvard University, and now SALA in Vancouver. Excerpts have been published in 2 international design journals. There have been 6 published book reviews in Canada and the US. A 7th in Canadian Architect is forthcoming next month. 7 feature stories and interviews have been held in television, radio, print, and podcast media in Canada, the US, and the UK, as well as a July guest op-ed piece in the Global Mail. So cue Matthew. I'm about to tell people a little bit about your background, and I'm going to ask you to get up in a minute. So Matthew Souls is an associate professor of architecture at SALA and founder of Matthew Souls Architecture. recipient of multiple professional awards, including a 2010 Emerging Firm and 2015 Special Jury Award from the Architectural Institute of British Columbia, and others from Architizer. He has also taught at the Southern California Institute of Architecture and Harvard University Graduate School of Design. In addition to Icebergs, Zombies, etc., Matthew is author of Binning House in SALA's West Coast Modern House series, and editor of Future Social, Design Ideas, Essays and Discussions on Social Housing for the Hardest to House. He also contributes to other people's books and to multiple journals on these and related topics, including Blog, Harvard Design Magazine, Praxis, the Journal for Architectural Education, Azure, Canadian Architect, and Topos, among others. So I've kept people warm and Matthew. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ron. I'd like to, just before I start my presentation, do some thank yous. One, I would like to thank Leslie Van Duzer for putting a lot of work into organizing this series, of which this talk tonight is part of. Of course, Inform Interiors, not least of which is Michael Young, who's sitting behind the technology right here, and his big efforts in helping tonight come together. I'd also like to thank all of the people who supported this book in various ways. I mean, to bring any project like this together takes a really large, extensive group of great humans. Many people read portions of my manuscript and also weighed in with all sorts of insights and feedback and criticism along the way. These folks are spread around the world, but they include some of my great SALA peers, and those are John Bass, Sherry McKay, and Sarah Stevens. They all read portions of the manuscript and provided great insights. I'd like to also thank Princeton Architectural Press for believing in this project and all of the effort they put into it, and my very great editor, Sarah Steeman. And I would really like to thank all of the students that I've had the tremendous opportunity to explore these ideas with. I've learned so much by teaching studios and seminars on this topic, and the student insights have been invaluable. And those are students primarily at SALA, but also at the GSD and also at SIRE. So their insights, I mean, I take responsibility for all the errors and omissions, but their insights have been invaluable. And lastly, thank you so much for coming here tonight and spending your time with us, with me. So I'm going to start. So capitalism in the 21st century is dominated by a specific mode of capitalism, what is called finance capitalism. So my book is an examination of architecture operating as an instrument or asset within finance capitalism. Finance capitalism and its associated practices have been around since the inception of capitalism. Different thinkers have positioned and conceptualized finance capitalism in various ways. So, for example, Giovanni Arrighi, the Italian economist, described the history of capitalism as having 4 dominant periods, what he called hegemons. So this is a very crude diagram representing the rise and fall of these hegemons. And he associated each hegemon with the capital city most commonly associated with them. So Genoa, Amsterdam, London, and New York for our current hegemon. Now, according to Arrighi, each hegemon comes into power with the accumulation of material, so material accumulation. But he ties this rise and fall very closely to finance, that each hegemon enters into a period of decline through a period of financialization, so financial expansion, the increasing deployment and kind of utilization of financial practices. So we're currently, according to Arrighi's schema, in a period of New York hegemon's decline, which is marked by a period of heightened financialization. Another possible, or another kind of schema for financialization is offered by the Greek economist Kostas Lapavitsas. So according to Lapavitsas, there's been two great periods of financial ascendancy in the history of capitalism. So the first from roughly 1875 to the interwar years, roughly 1930. And then the second, which we're in right now, the second great financial ascendancy from around 1980 to the present. Another person, Frederick Jameson, the American philosopher and political theorist, describes things differently when it comes to financialization. He describes a continuous cycle between three moments, what he calls an epidemic of epidemics, that is always present and in play in the dynamics of capitalism. So first, on the upper left, the accumulation of money through trade. That moment transitions at one point to the second moment, where capital is invested in agriculture and manufacture. And then the third moment, financialization, which he most closely aligns with speculative practices. And Jameson wrote extensively on this and argued that we are in an era of late capitalism in which speculation and financialization is the defining moment, or defining characteristics. So, while individuals like Arrighi, Lapavitsas, and Jameson offer different positions of finance over history, they all agree that something significant happened around 1980. So, for example, this is a quote from Jameson, I think everyone will agree that finance capital is one of the distinctive features of late capitalism, or in other words, of the distinctive state of things today. And he wrote that in 1998. So, what exactly is finance capitalism? I mean, you hear the term used a lot. What exactly is it? There are no shortage of definitions and descriptions. I like this description of financialization, so the process in which financial capitalism comes into dominance and prominence, offered by Greta R. Krippner, who is an American sociologist who wrote published an incredibly influential paper that described meticulously and quantitatively how the American economy had shifted into a financial mode of operation. So according to Greta, financialization is a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. Financial here refers to activities relating to the provision or transfer of liquid capital in expectation of future interests, dividends, and capital gains. Notice the phrase liquid capital. That's going to return in a little bit. So, financialization can be demonstrated in many, many ways, almost countless ways. So you can look at the size and volume of currency markets and how they have grown exponentially since around 1980. In fact, the biggest markets in the world are the currency markets. You can also look at where firms get their profit from, as Greta Krippner did. So take car companies. Increasingly, car companies make money by the financing of the cars that they sell, as opposed to the sales at which they're sold at markup. And so you can look across all sorts of industries and see this shift away from productive markup capital accumulation to this financial through dividends, interest, and capital gains. Or you can look, oops,
I got it.
I pressed the wrong button. These buttons are very, very close to each other. Thank you, Michael. Or you can look at something very, very basic like this. Look at that little dot right there. That is the market capitalization of all companies on all the world stock exchanges in 1980. So it's like $1.7 trillion. By 2018, it is, and this is in constant US dollars, adjusted, it is about $68 trillion, right? So there's kind of massive increase in the wealth and activity of corporations playing or operating on the world stock markets. So, in parallel and related to the metrics of financialization is a very important basic backdrop to all of this. And that is literally that there is a historically unprecedented amount of money in the world, a radically unprecedented amount of money in the world that occurs in the era of financialization. Some observers refer to this as the giant pool of money. Manuel Albers, a great scholar in Belgium who has a wonderful book on the financialization of housing, calls it the Great Wall of Money. Here, there's so many different kind of snapshots of how to represent this. In this case, this is data from the IMF, showing the cumulative, the total value of all assets across the globe that are under management. So in some sort of management fund, hedge fund, mutual fund, so on and so forth. Around 1980, it's a little over $10 trillion. This is in US funds. By 2010, it's about 80 trillion. This year, 2021, it's about $101 trillion. Again, these are adjusted numbers. So, this giant pool of money is critical for architecture because architecture is a preferred medium of finance and speculation, right? So, all of this capital needs a place to go, right? Because in the ethos and era of finance capitalism, the current hegemon or the current ascendancy, this money is growing, this capital is growing, but you don't just save it in savings accounts, which interestingly actually used to be something that people did not that long ago, right? You just keep the money in a savings account. No longer. That would be considered, unfathomable waste. You have to make that money work. And the capital has grown at such a speed that all the traditional ways to make it work get exhausted, right? So you get more and more amounts of this giant wall of money flowing into places in unprecedented ways. And one of those places is the built environment, our cities. David Harvey has written quite a bit about this, about how architecture and urbanism are the place in which surplus capital becomes absorbed. But anyway, to go back to Arrighi, this is not entirely new. What is new is the magnitude and the global spread. But as he says, you remember that diagram of the four hegemons, then as now, a significant portion of capital tended to flow into speculation and into conspicuous consumption. Then, as now, investment in real estate within capitalist cities themselves were the most important means of combining speculation with conspicuous consumption. So, this giant pool of money, or the great wall of money, flowing into cities, flowing into buildings, I argue is mutating them, transforming them, so that they better serve the logics of finance capital. And so much we can describe broad characteristics of finance capitalist architecture, or maybe what you might call asset architecture. And the first one is that finance capitalist architecture is inherently unstable and creates spaces of crisis. Now, why do I say this? So, as we all know, capitalist markets are defined by the waxing and waning, the ebbs and flows of expansions and contractions, right? And the more tightly architecture and urbanism is aligned to those market vicissitudes, and in the era of the giant pool of money, where the amplitude of the vicissitudes appears to be increasing, we have more frequently these overshoots of overbuilding, over-speculation, followed by precipitous collapses that leave in their wake vacancy, abandonment, and a whole host of social, cultural, and political challenges. And there's no shortage of examples of this. And of course, the 2007-2008 financial crisis offers up a ton of them. So here, for example, is Ascaya, which is a quote-unquote luxury development at the edges of Las Vegas in Nevada, in the hills. It was, all the land work was done, and right at the collapse, it was left abandoned. And it continues to exist like this to this day, except there's even a stranger aspect of it. Now there's a handful of individual, super large, quote-unquote luxury homes occupying this sort of pharaonic kind of ancient Egyptian earthwork. That very interestingly, I mean, like I took this photo with a drone, you know, this is like many years after the collapse. And I was like, man, it is perfectly kind of, where's the desert scrub and growth and, you know, this kind of stuff. And so on closer inspection, they're constantly, for like a decade, sweeping. They have, you know, and a big aspect to all of this are questions of equity, questions of race, proliferate all through this conversation about finance, capitalism, urbanism. So here there are people whose job is to sweep this landscape for decades, or a decade, sorry, in some sort of strange aesthetic preoccupation that I think is worthy of unpacking. Of course, Ireland and the infamous ghost estates, the abandoned, stalled housing projects around 2007, 2008. This is outside Longford in Ireland. All sorts of, when me and some research assistants visited Ireland, such an odd landscape. And I mean, this was many years out after the crisis. These kind of, you know, this is a long stalled area of the city in Ireland where there were these kind of roads encased in quote unquote temporary construction hoarding that had become permanent in the sense of, you know, 6, 7, 8 years. And we started to call these kind of roads to nowhere. Spain, of course. So this is a photograph that one of my research assistants took in Zaragoza. And I mean, you know, you sort of live in proximity to this big hole, again, for not a short period of time. And then these vast expanses of just empty space with infrastructure all installed. In addition to the spaces of the kind of propensity towards spaces of crises, is that finance capitalist architecture increasingly functions as speculative wealth storage. And you can witness this in a number of different examples, but the title of the book includes Icebergs. This is a section drawing of a proposed iceberg for the borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London. And these are these kind of really fascinating examples of where, you know, you have a lot of global capital pouring into London and certain neighborhoods being very desirable for that capital. And that being met with very strict zoning requirements that govern everything that happens above grade. But the capital wanting to be absorbed, right? To materialize itself in some sort of physical construction. And the architects that were involved in the early ones of these in London, there's this great quote from one of the architects, Adam Boltich, who says, he's like, you know, we looked at all the bylaws and zoning and we realized that absolutely nothing was governing or prohibiting us from doing anything underground. We could literally burrow, and he's quoted, we could burrow all the way to the South Pole and no one would stop us. Right? So, you know, in this drawing you see, you know, a swimming pool on the lower left or the lower right. On the very lower left, you see a parking garage, so your car elevators taking cars all the way down. You see a ballroom. This is a silver store. And, you know, there's been some really great research out of Newcastle looking at these in London and some meticulous mapping. And there's hundreds of these. You know, they've categorized them into different sort of scales, like large extensions, super large extensions, so on and so forth. These are some photographs. They very often include pools. And it's really interesting, actually, the kind of atmospheres and architectural details of these subterranean spaces. Obviously, lighting and how that kind of works to produce certain qualities is key. You know, there's often, you know, play spaces, movie theaters, wine storage, sometimes car museums. So this again, these kind of excesses of kind of wealth accumulation. And London is where the phrase iceberg mansion emerged from, and that's where the phenomena has been up until now most pronounced. But it's not only something that happens there, and it's not only something that happens with modifications to existing homes, which was the most frequent case in London, existing mansions, townhomes, or row houses. But you see it with new construction, and it's recently come to my attention that there's some homes that have gone up in Metro Vancouver in very recent times that would certainly categorize, or fall into the category of iceberg mansions. The CBC reached out to me last week about, and some of you might know about this, but there's one proposed in Toronto right now that is spawning a lot of controversy. So number 3, finance capitalist architecture is the means of uneven development and heightened inequality. So not only is the giant pool of money a backdrop to financialization, but in the post-1980s era, the era of financialization, this financial ascendancy, there is a pretty indisputable growing inequity in many, many countries around the world. So for instance, the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, has been rising in almost all of the OECD countries since 1980, including our own country. And the built environment is, of course, one of the primary territory domains in which this is materialized, actualized. And the examples of this are really essentially endless. To show you one that's close to home, like a kind, what myself think of as a very strange avatar of this inequality, is to do with our very own Vancouver House. And I think Vancouver House is a project that extends beyond Vancouver in very literal terms. On the left, we have a photograph of an interior of one of the condominium units, of the kitchen, of course. And interestingly, the kitchen island is a kind of scale model in a simplified version or perfected version of the building itself and flipped on its side. So meal preparations, or whatever one does around one of these islands and one of these units happen around this model. And on the right is Vancouver House in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And why I say that is that as part of the marketing campaign, and let's say the ethical campaign of Vancouver House, was what was called by the proponents and folks at West Bank the world's first one-to-one home gifting program. So for every unit that was bought at Vancouver House, condominium unit, one home for a family in need, that's their language, was constructed in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, in this particular neighborhood. So each stair you see on the right is a stair into one of the units. One of these units, social housing units in Cambodia, cost $2,500. And the folks behind this campaign, this campaign wasn't invented by West Bank. It was invented by some Vancouver realtors whose specialty was luxury real estate developments all up and down the West Coast, who wanted to do something philanthropic. And when describing this project, they're very proud of the fact that how this was an incredible marketing opportunity. And such an incredible marketing opportunity that the $2,500 units that were built generated marketing value that far surpassed that. So they actually saved West Bank quite a bit of money by doing this. So I think this is an example of the very strange ethical acrobatics and what I would call perversions that occur in the era of finance capitalism and how they can be played out in the built environment. So, number 4, finance capitalist architecture has a simultaneous propensity for being highly iconic and extremely standardized. And we could show many, many different examples of this. Here is a drone photograph that, again, I took in Torreviejo, Spain. What we see in the foreground is a pavilion designed by Toyo Ito. It was never finished because of the economic collapse that happened. It's being vandalized, lit on fire. You can kind of climb into it and experience the kind of massing of it. But it clearly aspires to a certain iconicism, a certain level of attraction, but it was built very consciously in tandem with the vast tracts of speculative, super standardized, super homogenized housing behind it. And I would argue that these two, on part of the developers and the investors, are working in concert, in which the iconicism functions in a spatio-financial ecology to attract investment desire into the homes behind. Now, of course, sometimes iconicism and a high degree of standardization and homogeneity coexist in exactly the same project. I mean, here is 56 Leonard by Herzog and de Meuron in Tribeca. And this is the marketing, a poster as part of the marketing campaign, and I find it a very interesting kind of lens in which to understand the simultaneity of homogeneity and iconicism. Now, number 5 of the broad characteristics is that finance capitalist architecture increases liquidity. Now, this is a really, really important point that I want to spend a little bit more time on, the topic of liquidity. So in relation to that giant pool of money, for finance capitalism to operate optimally, it seeks to make architecture more liquid. Now, what exactly is liquidity? Here, like if we go directly inside the discourse of the finance community, to the definition offered by Investopedia, the belly of the beast, so to speak. The definition is, liquidity refers to the efficiency or ease with which an asset or security can be converted into ready cash without affecting its market price. The most liquid asset of all is cash itself. Now, when you think about it, right? So $1 Canadian bill is exactly alike every other $1 Canadian bill. Very easily and rapidly interchangeable, almost entirely frictionless. Not totally frictionless, but almost, as close as we can get. And that is hyperliquid. Now, very interestingly, this is a video still taken from a tutorial, an introductory tutorial on the concept of liquidity, again from Investopedia.com. Now, almost every introductory description of liquidity includes very prominently within it, to help unpack the concept, a description of what is not liquid, so what is illiquid, the opposite of cash. And almost always that description is a building, right? It's a piece of architecture, a piece of real estate. In this case, it's a single-family home with some greenery and shrubs around the edge, a deck, a pitched roof, a door with some stairs. The door is visible from the ground. It's got 4 exterior walls. Not always in the tutorial is it a single-family home, very often, but sometimes it's kind of mid-rise structure, small-scale kind of multi-family housing unit. So this is exactly what is not liquid. So really, what I want to just make very clear, we can understand, well, I mean, it is typically understood that liquidity exists on a spectrum. At one end is cash, totally liquid, and at the other end is real estate, and with it, architecture, entirely illiquid. And you can place on here all other possible assets. So stock equities are not as liquid as cash, but they're pretty far along. Fine art, a painting by your favorite painter that you hope is going to rise in value exponentially over your lifetime. It's not as illiquid as real estate, but it's far along the spectrum in that direction. Now, here, there's a common maxim or credo that I'm sure you're all familiar with or all heard, right? That I think is critical to understanding real estate's illiquidity and the larger implications for architecture in the era of finance capitalism. And that credo or maxim is all real estate is local, right? So why is this important? When you think about it, what constitutes locality is a huge ingredient for why architecture and with it real estate are illiquid, right? So our typical understanding of the built environment is that every building is designed by a different architect, or many buildings are designed by many architects. They have their own preoccupations, and they make the design in a certain way. The plans are somewhat unique, the sections are unique materials are used, so on and so forth, right? But then, of course, there's the kind of block that it sits on, and every block is a little different. Every neighborhood is a little different. Own set of human beings that live there, the demographic reality, right? How close is it to transit? How close is it to a park? What's the pollution like? What's the weather like? Is it noisy? Is it quiet? Are the neighbors partying? On and on and on. This is highly, highly local, hyper-specific, the opposite of the standardization of cash, that $1 bill is the same as every other dollar bill. And traditionally speaking, to be a responsible purchaser and investor of real estate, one has to become knowledgeable and cognizant of at least some degree of all of that local specificity. Now, to do that takes a lot of time. You have to go and visit the place. You have to do your due diligence. You have to hire a bunch of inspectors. You have to hire a home inspector. You have to hire a notary. You have to get a whole bunch of people involved. All of this local specificity and the rituals around it make investing in real estate traditionally very, very time-consuming, very, very illiquid. Now, I argue that in the era of finance capitalism, that there is an inordinate amount of pressure that is so omnipresent that it almost escapes, well, I would say it almost entirely escapes our attention as a kind of unified front of transformation, to move real estate along that spectrum to become more cash-like, to become more like a stock equity. And the way in which this shift occurs happens in a many-fold complex manner. One is that financial instruments proper are increasingly tethered to the physical materiality of the built environment and serve as a tethered proxy of liquidity. So, to be specific, real estate investment trusts and mortgage-backed securities are financial instruments. They're also financial instruments that in the grand scope of human history are entirely new. In the United States, there was no such thing. It wasn't legally possible for it to exist, a real estate investment trust, until 1960. A mortgage-backed security was only enabled in 1968. But that's when they were kind of quote-unquote invented. Doesn't mean that they picked up in popularity then. In fact, they don't pick up into widespread popularity until post-1980s, 1990s. And so they had their radical ascendancy in the post-1980s era of financialization. A real estate investment trust, for those of you who don't know, it is a way to invest in a company that's publicly traded on a stock market that has its primary income from real estate. It's a unique construct, right? So instead of investing in that time-consuming, slow individual building, this is a relatively liquid entity that you can invest in as a tethered proxy. Mortgage-backed securities are similar, right? Mortgage-backed securities are traded securities, stocks essentially, that are traded on a market that allow everyday people and institutions to have a participation in the debt market for mortgages. So it's another way to invest in the built environment. And by the way, for all of those mortgage-backed securities to occur, means that a huge amount of physical construction has to happen, to enable, to unlock the possibility for mortgage-backed security. So those are examples of changes that are totally new and have huge implications, mutational implications. But they happen in combination with legal changes to property law. So I know in a city like Vancouver, we're all deeply familiar with condominiums, right? But condominium or strata laws, it's a legal invention. I mean, condominium, we often we use it to denote a kind of style of building, or in Vancouver, like a tower or whatnot. But it actually is a law, and it comes about in the 1960s in Canada, the United States, and Australia. And what is super radical about this, actually, but again, let me just say quickly, the same way these were invented in the 1960s, it takes a while for the 1960s legal change to take off. And again, it's something that really takes off post-1980s, right? So what's amazing about this, though, is that in Canada, in the United States, prior to strata laws, it was literally legally impossible for anyone to own a piece of real estate, a space, that was not physically directly attached to the ground. Right? So you could have a single family home because it was on the ground. You could have a townhouse because it was on the ground, a row house, a duplex. You could own a huge building with thousands of units in it, but you could own the entire building. You couldn't own one of those units on the 23rd floor. Right? You could own it, rent it out. You could own a share in a co-op, which was very common. But actually, legally, you don't own the co-op. You don't own the unit, historically. You own a share in the co-op, and then upon mutual agreement, you have the right to use a space. So for the first time in modern human history, in the 1960s, we have the capability to own space in the sky. And that is significant here. It's especially significant when you understand it happening in tandem with real estate investment trusts, mortgage-backed securities. In the 1970s, something seemingly simple but yet profound happens. That's the thing about one of these things. They're very simple in isolation, but when they all understand together, they have Doppler-like effects that change everything. You have the advent of global real estate brokerages, right? Pretty simple thing. But for the first time, you had single companies whose marketing and real estate expertise span the planet, which is an incremental step to liberate global capital to be making investments en masse around the world. And all of this gets a real kick around, starting around the millennium with the way in which technology radically changes all of our lives. So there's a new and very prominent growing area of technology. Well, one called fintech, financial technology, right? And then a subset of fintech is PropTech, property technology. And some of these property technologies are they're so sort of everyday that we don't think of them as being that significant. But something like the ability to have MLS listings on your phone that covers the entire country, that gives cost comparability at your hand, is an incremental step to this kind of liquidity. Like Zillow in the United States does that and actually has a profound effect. And then there are all these kind of sub-layers of technology associated with these things. So all of these are working in a complex milieu and architectural form. Form itself is also working in tandem with these other elements. And all together, they're pushing towards increased liquidity, moving the building down that spectrum. Now, in the book, I talk about like the forms of finance, and I talk about 5. This is not an exhaustive list, but I'm especially intrigued with these 5. So number 1 on the upper left, Iceberg homes, we touched on those already. Speculative wealth storage. Number 5 on the right, we touched on that. Financial icons, attractors that work within a spatio-financial ecology. I mean, that's a silhouette of Bilbao, right? Gary's Bilbao. I mean, what really is the Bilbao effect that was so famous? I mean, the Bilbao effect is largely a financial investment effect. How a struggling post-industrial city that couldn't, that was bleeding capital and population was transformed into a kind of hub and center through the iconicism and spectacle nature of this project. Number two, and be careful not to press the wrong button. Ex-urban, what I call ex-urban investment mats. And these are self-similar housing units. They're very homogeneous, they're very standardized, they're vast in numbers. The standardization makes them more like currency. The large numbers literally expands the number of assets in the market, and an increased number of assets tends to increase liquidity unto themselves. And these ex-urban investment mats increasingly take on gargantuan dimensions, taking up huge amounts of territory across the planet. Like, I was really, really struck when I went to Spain, for instance, looking for these things. And then the very obvious reality hit me is like, wow, whenever I've gone to Spain, which I love, Spain is a fascinating and wonderful country, I've always gone to, these historic centers with their amazing kind of cultural life, and I go to these institutions, and it completely escaped me that vast amounts of Spain are covered with really disturbing development. It's completely disastrous in many ways. And it was sort of right there, but I never looked for it. So huge amounts of the planet are getting covered with these things. Number three, and we're in Vancouver, a place famous for its podium towers. So super podiums. I think in the era of finance capitalism, there's an increased emphasis on the role of the podium, and that the podium takes on increasingly large dimensions, and it typically has retail and commercial units or kind of livability functions. But I think that actually the units of investment, the housing units that sit above, are effectively delocalized or diminished in local specificity by being raised above and disentangled from the messy unpredictability of the public. So of course podiums have existed for a long time. They've been around since as long as there's been something to put on a podium. But within finance capitalism, I would argue that they expanded to an almost universal plane, allowing architectural assets to kind of float above in a sort of vast field of relative interchangeability. And then down here, the kind of apotheosis of, the ultra-thin pencil tower, apotheosis of simplification, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more in a bit, the facilitation of remote ownership, which I think is a key dimension here. Just very quickly, some photographs. So this is in Nevada, what I would call an increment of an ex-urban investment mat right here. And this one is quite finite in its dimensions, but what you would see is them popping up incrementally, and then coalescing into one mat. And the spacing between the ostensibly single-family structures is so these are absolutely spatially, materially autonomous, each single home, but they're so packed together that I think you can start to understand them as one continuous mat. That this is just a sort of vestige of the semiotics of a single-family home. This is in the Mediterranean coast in Spain. Again, here, ex-urban investment mats flowing over the dramatic topography. I think, if my memory is correct, near Alicante. And here, it's very clear that Northern European aspirations for sunlight, the ocean, Gulf, in many cases, have coalesced with a speculative real estate impulse. Right? So there's a lot of documented Northern European capital flowing in and resulting in these kind of leisure/investment landscapes. Mexico provides really shocking dimensions of ex-urban investment maps. This and the next two photographs are taken by a really great artist named Livia Corona Benjamin as part of her project called 2 Million Homes for Mexico. This is at the edge of Mexico City called San Buenaventura. This was part of a scheme that has ultimately resulted in about 1/6 of the housing for 1/6 of the Mexican population. People that were struggling on the socioeconomic kind of spectrum to be housed. And it effectively is a privatization of the social housing system in Mexico, in which Wall Street investors were heavily involved in terms of the lending, but also in the financing of the construction companies and all of the producers of this. And vast in scale, disturbing in its like ultra homogenization and ultra standardization. This is another example, part of the same kind of project in Ensenada in Baja California. This is in Durango, an image from some of the backyards, again, all by Livia Corona Benjamin. These have been widely criticized. They're problematically located. They're very far from jobs and income, and poorly constructed, and a whole host of social ills, and there's been a big backlash against them. But a lot of people made a lot of money on these projects. A lot of investors in the companies in the New York Stock Exchange made a lot of money. This is a super podium, Zorlu Center in Istanbul by Emre Erla Architecture. Here you can see this is a kind of roof plan of sorts, this sort of vast new nature, undulating green, and I think very tellingly, the white squares, the 4 white squares are the kind of the places in which the condominium towers, the units of investment, if you want to subscribe to my language, are located. And this is the project from afar and sort of closer in, and this kind of new natures in which the old kind of messy and entangled city exists below, and these new kind of constructs in relative isolation. But no shortage of these. We could look to Vancouver and like I think Aquarius and Conco Pacific by James Cheng is a really interesting example of a super podium. In our case, it takes on a kind of romantic sustainability guise with fish-stocked pool and community garden, but it's serving, I think, a similar function. Here is Architectonica's Icon Brickell project in Miami, in which the condominium towers rise over this vast podium. And then, in Miami, because it's Miami, you don't have the sustainability landscape on the podium, but you have a vast kind of leisure scape. In this case, a kind of ginormous pool. And then you can see the other towers beyond their podiums. Now, the era of finance capitalism has also witnessed a steady march towards slenderness and height in condominium towers. And this is exemplified in sharp relief in New York City, but it can also be witnessed elsewhere. Here is a kind of diagram that shows a series of representative housing projects that arrive at Shop Architects, 111 West 57th Street, which is finished this year. This is the section to the building, and it's a remarkable building. It's a remarkable building by any measure, but certainly, its height, its roof height is 1,428 feet. To put that in perspective, Shangri-La, Vancouver, where we are, its tallest building is 659 feet, so this is more than twice as tall. It's the world's second tallest residential tower. The tallest one is just down the street. It was just completed or wrapping up, called Central Park South. This is the slenderest of the new residential towers. This is ultra thin. So this is a 1 to 23 slenderness ratio. So the most slender regularly inhabitable tower in the world. And remarkably, it has 58 units. So a pretty small number of units by my account. Shangri-La, just by comparison, has 307 condominium units and 119 hotel units. So this is 58 units. So this is, I would say, literally and conceptually the height of finance capitalist architecture, right? It has, what I would argue, the radically simplified unit within it. It makes possible literally through its formal proportional morphology. It's absolutely a question of core disciplinary tactics. It's not some immaterial abstraction, it's a material reality. That material reality, the decision by the architects and the developers, moves it along the spectrum towards cash and stock-like liquidity. It doesn't get there all the way, but it moves it along. So, what are the ways, right? Some of them are, well, most of them are simple, but again, I think when you combine them, it's profound in my view. So, something like this, each unit within here requires minimal security and minimal maintenance at the scale of ownership, right? So when you think about it, right, it has a single controlled access point at the ground. Very hard to make your way up here if you don't have a reason to go up there. Also, the condominium management structure collectivizes maintenance, right, at the scale of the unit, at the scale of ownership. But in terms of morphology and programming, maintenance problems at the scale of the unit are also minimized. Think back to that image of illiquidity from Investopedia, right? The image of illiquidity. Here there's no garden to maintain, there's no roof to repair. In fact, that image of illiquidity had a 1-to-1 ratio between something like the roof and the unit of investment. This has a 1-to-58 ratio of that possible moment of failure, right? This is critical in terms of facilitating remote ownership. You could physically not inhabit a unit within this building for 9 months, 12 months, a year and a half, and be reasonably sure that it's absolutely just fine. There's no need, or the need for bodily, regular contact is reduced, right? Not the case with that image of illiquidity from Investopedia. No one's going around there, the grass is growing, someone might vandalize it, someone might break in, some kids might do something you don't want, the roof might fail, on and on and on, right? Needs regular contact. Pretty simple thing, but pretty profound. And if you think this is not at play in the logics of the people making these buildings, I would call your attention to the fact that some of these buildings literally market themselves as having things that don't require you to be there very often. Even in Vancouver, there's been projects that say, just as icing on the cake, we offer asset protection services, where we will go into your unit and we will turn the taps on once in a while when you're not there. This is not, they're explicit that this is part of the logic. And let's not forget, the units are pulled far, far into the sky, And that sky is a simplified, socially disentangled territory that's completely divorced from the messy unpredictability of the ground. So I would say all of this translates into a protected post-social asset. Almost a kind of form of housing that is post-housing, right? Housing being something else. This is a floor plan from 111 West 57th. For a building to be so tall and only have 58 units means that all of the units are either one entire floor or extend over 2 floors. So the elevator deposits you directly in your unit. Gone, right, is the shared horizontal circulation space, and with it any possibility of a chance encounter with other human beings. Another way in which the ultra-thin is a kind of post-social architecture. Now, it would be a mistake to think that ultra-thinness can only be found in towers of Midtown Manhattan. You can find it in towers elsewhere, but it's not only in towers. The morphology of ultra-thinness and its ethos can be found elsewhere. So, for example, take One Hyde Park, here by Rogers Stirk Harbour and Partners in London. You can understand this building, actually, as, so it typically has very large units that take up almost the entire kind of promontory and exposed spaces of these edges. But you can think of this building as being like 4 fragments of a tall super tower that have been broken apart and brought to the ground and arrayed across, right? So a tall, thin tower has been chopped into 4 segments. And I find the diagrams that have been created by the architects to explain why the building is the way it is very, very interesting. So the prime operational diagram here, and this is it, is, and when you really look at it in relation to the planning decisions, is that the entire building shall be organized in such a way that you can have, be surrounded by glass and see not any possible glimpse of your neighbors in these other spaces, right? So, and this is made possible through the planning of the outer geometry, but also the inner walls and how the skin operates. It has louvers that direct your vision so you would never, heaven forbid, see across, right? Of course, there are a series of, again, what are called private elevators that you rise up and deposit you in your unit, right? So, and let's not forget, right, that all of this is happening in a culture and set of practices in which emptiness, effective emptiness, occurs much of the time. This is a picture of One Hyde Park at night. So, famously underoccupied, and this is because these units of investment are commonly functioning as 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th homes that are rarely inhabited. It's not that they're owned, it's not that they're not owned or not furnished, it's just how they fit within a larger investment portfolio. So many jurisdictions are grappling with this problem, right, of zombie urbanism. Right? So, Barcelona is said to have 100,000 empty units or underused units. Manhattan, 122,000 owned but empty units. Paris, about 200,000, right? And jurisdictions around the world are enacting laws to try to combat that problem. Vancouver did its empty homes tax in 2016, Melbourne 2017, Toronto will come into effect in 2023. Hangzhou, China has a rule that no single adult can buy a 2nd home or a 3rd home or a 4th home. That's how they cracked it. 2017 study by Chinese academics reported that 21% of all homes in China are effectively unoccupied. There's a crisis unfolding with Evergrande, the huge developer in China right now, and it's back in the news about how millions and millions of underused or vacant homes exist, right? And then there's a conversation, will this be the thing that pulls us into another financial crisis of global? Are they too big to fail, right? Is a real conversation. To underscore this, Xi Jinping said in 2017 at the 19th Party Congress announced, to the Congress that houses are built to be inhabited, not for speculation, underscoring the challenge. Now, I'm going to try to wrap up really quickly. This is a marketing launch for a condominium in Toronto. And this is, with some renderings of the project. These are all the folks who will sell the project. Right? So these kind of launches happen all the time. Now, really, really interestingly, I know because we're in Vancouver, you all are so familiar with pre-sales. I think pre-sales are very interesting. manifestation of this move towards liquidity. So in many jurisdictions like ours, investors can buy an assignment to purchase a unit before construction starts, and effectively many years before a building is complete and ready for occupation, right? So you can buy one, 5 years out, 3 years out, 4 years out. Sometimes this is 7 years out, right? How far out can it go conceptually? 10 years, 12 years, 20 years? And really remarkably, there exists a robust market where these pre-sale assignments are exchanged unto themselves, right? And this happens for a number of reasons, but largely for speculative reasons. And legally, these are not considered real estate transactions, and therefore they're not subject to the same tax regimes or public accounting. So there's a relative cloak of secrecy that happens around these. So, effectively, this is a drawing or diagram by one of my students, Neil Aspinall. Effectively, the pre-sale market is a version of an architectural futures market in which floor plans, renders, and renderings operate as financial assets. The physical structure of the building is diminished in significance. Architecture moves even closer to the utopia of finance capitalism, that of heightened liquidity. From this vantage point, we can even think of digital rendering software as financial technology, as a piece of fintech. Now, this is 432 Park Avenue by Raphael Vignoli. It's 1,396 feet in height. It has a perfect square plan of 93.5 feet. Each facade is identical and each window is 10 by 10 meters square. It has 104 units. Its slenderness ratio is 1 to 15. It is ultra thin. It is the third highest building in New York City by roof height. By all accounts, the building is largely empty most of the time. This is hard to figure out because it's held, relatively in secret, but census data, tax registries, and talking with industry insiders says that it's, about 25% occupied at any given moment. So, this conveys a very crucial point. The financialization of architecture no longer requires inhabitation at all. So this is not actually a story about conspicuous consumption, but rather a new, relatively disembodied state of architecture. This is an elevation of the spire of the Woolworth Building in New York City by Cass Gilbert. When this was finished in 1912, it was the world's tallest building and reigned tallest for 17 years. It was a command and control center for industrial capitalism, office space, a mode of capitalism in which goods are produced and sold at markup. It was, of course, later surpassed in height by other office buildings. But something very interesting happens in the era of finance capitalism. And that is, in the 21st century, that the tallest buildings in many cities become relatively thin and tall condominium towers. It happened in Vancouver in 2009, happened in Edmonton in 2017. These are Canadian examples. It's currently underway in Toronto and Montreal, buildings that are under construction. So I asked, what does it ultimately mean when something like the tallest buildings of the land are no longer office spaces where people physically came together to work, but rather are private units that are speculative wealth storage assets, many of them effectively empty. For most of history, actually, what were considered towers were actually largely empty, all right? That they weren't intended for regular inhabitation. Right here is this depiction of Zoroastrian towers of silence. This depiction was drawn in the late 18th century. And here these towers were built, and these were towers for the time. Dead bodies in Zoroastrian death rituals were taken to the very top level and left there to be excarnated by the birds. Right? So, in fact, towers prior to the advent of industrial capitalism were very often of a spiritual nature. they were constructs that explicitly mediated between physical presence and the present, and an immaterial, spiritually, physically absent transcendence. Now here, I would like to quote very simply Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, when he says, "Capitalism is a pure religious cult, perhaps the most extreme there ever was." This is a prominent rendering that was part of the marketing campaign for 432 Park Avenue. I find it truly kind of endlessly intriguing. The empty bathtub calls forth the body, the naked body, the totally alone body, the socially disentangled body, the body of finance capitalism that is isolated and entirely private. Yet the emptiness of the bathtub also emphasizes that the body isn't even a requisite. Reinhold Martin, the American architectural historian, has used the term real virtualities. So what we are witnessing, in my mind, are the construction of real virtualities for the dominant spiritual practice of today, the spiritual practice being finance capitalism. And this is a condition where the sheltering, corporeal function of architecture is de-emphasized to allow it to operate optimally as a preferred medium of finance. That's all I have. Sorry, I feel long. If anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them. I apologize for going a little long. Anyone have questions?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. One thing that you put probably in your book, but we don't know exactly where we're at with it is the money laundering. So that's an illegitimate speculation. Does your book mention it at all? Or, I mean, to the extent you can?
Yeah. It's a really good point. Yeah. It's a really good point. I don't get into it in the book, but clearly I will. I mean, there's certainly lots of popular media discussion around this, and also investigations that would be launched by various jurisdictions that seem to give some weight to the speculations about it. Yeah, I mean, like Panama City is a very interesting example of this, and Panama City is also a place of exceptionally slender and tall condominium towers, and there's been some interesting investigations and reports into money laundering behind those towers, and certainly, Vancouver is a place where that's suspected. I don't go into it in the book. Thanks for your question.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for the fascinating talk, as usual. I guess just some of the images were really compelling, captivating, and the early images, I didn't realize they were originals that I'd seen in the excerpts. But just seeing those now, something that came to mind was those ghost and zombie urbanisms. I guess just having lived in Chicago now for the past 3 years, just coming from a different kind of context, a post-industrial kind of landscape of the former Rust Belt of the Midwest, Chicago, Indianapolis, even Detroit, DC. I guess that what came to mind is kind of the another kind of perversion or extreme polarization of, on the one hand you have these empty ghost speculative urbanisms, but then on the other hand, these landscapes or urbanisms of disinvestment. And I just wonder if you kind of if you thought about that as you've been writing this book, and I guess and then I guess maybe the broader question to that is, I guess, the ethical kind of implications of all of this to architecture or the discipline, and if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you so much for the question. I think one interesting, so let's take zombie urbanism, which in the book I describe as being a form of under-occupancy that's primarily through owned but underused units, in which that rate of under-occupancy isn't enough to render a general perception that a project or a neighborhood or a city is dead, but it's significant enough that it's not fully alive. Like it's operating significantly under capacity, but not so much to reach a kind of widespread perception of crisis. And so the prevalence of zombie urbanism in cities around the world, I think, calls into question a long-standing assumption about what constitutes success and failure, or growth and decay, in urban planning, urban design, and architectural ideology and pedagogy, which is to say that we have a common dyad where Detroit or post-Katrina New Orleans are failures, and one of the manifestations of that failure is vacant lots and abandoned homes. And then, Shenzhen, China, in the Pearl River Delta, with its rapid economic acceleration, is a story of success that we witness in all of these kind of new buildings and construction activity. But zombie urbanism, I think, problematizes that dyad, that polarity, and destabilizes it, right? So I think, and I think necessitates, because it's kind of like empty successes, like instant new ruins. And so I think there's a kind of new manifestations and avatars that I think make us question whether the dichotomy between something we see in the Rust Belt and something we see in, say, the Pearl River Delta is the only way to understand contemporary urbanism. So your second aspect of your question, the ethics and the discipline and the practice, if I understand that correctly, yeah, I mean, it's a big question, tricky question to answer. I mean, at Cooper Union, where I gave a version of this talk, and there was a discussion afterwards with Peggy Deemer and Jack Self. I mean, Peggy Deemer was very adamant that what architects need to do is refuse to do work, like increasingly say no. So she was like, no architect should do 111 West 57. That is clearly a piece of financialized architecture building, and the architect should say no, which is, obviously a very contentious position, and not everyone's going to agree with that. That's one stance to take, right? I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the AIA, for instance, has taken positions on like, what about designing prisons? We don't think that should be good. I mean, should the AIBC, the AFBC say, we are no longer going to give any prizes to any architect for when they submit a project for a single family home when it has a size beyond a certain threshold in relation to the reasonable expectation of an habitation. Like, we as a discipline are going to be leaders to say we do not support this kind of waste anymore, right? That's an option. I mean, one thing we must recognize is that architecture, throughout its history, is largely an elite profession that designs things for extremely wealthy people, and often in contexts that involve really questionable social structures. The architecture profession is so much about inequality. So how do we, many different ways to tackle that. What I think is a beginning is that architects are super good, and Jack Self made this really very eloquently in the Cooper Union talk, which is recorded. We'll just pass forward to the discussion because the presentations tonight is quite similar, but he was like, architects are very good at absorbing all sorts of diverse pieces of information from very heterogeneous knowledge sets and disciplines, right? Structural engineering, ecological systems, on and on. But there's this line that's drawn between economic and financial factors. Of course, yes, there are kind of real estate specialists in some architecture schools, but generally they don't intermingle. And so, I think that we need to expand our engagement with the kind of financial practices as a beginning place, right?
One last one. One last one? Two last. Two.
Hi, Matt. Heroic talk, heroic project. Congrats to you. Since we had a bottle of wine that published Square last summer, I had a chance to look at the book. The big revelation tonight for me is that you, Matt Solz, are the drone operator. Now, it sounds like a giveaway, but I think it's actually a way into a critique of the book. I think the book is a pure exemplar of the very forces you criticize. In other words, the book itself is an artifact of late financial capitalism. The book is quite remarkable, for the only characters or people in it are the economists who walk into the early pages. Of all your travels, there seems to have been almost no conversations with people that made it into the book as quotations. The overwhelming visual metaphor of your book is the aerial shot, the drone-operated aerial shot. And to me, that is an exemplar of financialization.
Mm-hmm.
That degree of remove and that degree of technique. So Matt Solz, are you the drone operator of the very forces you criticize?
Thanks, Trevor. So Trevor sent me a message, and like he didn't have a registration for tonight's event. He's like, "Do you think you can sneak your frenemy in?" No, thanks. Thanks so much for the question. And critique. I mean, I'm not sure. Well, what I would say is this, is that, I mean, I think I partly am. I hope I'm not entirely. So I think, this subject matter is a very complex subject matter that is also played out on all of our individual bodies and cognitive structures. And I am, like all of us here, I think a highly financialized being. And, sometimes the book is being variably critiqued, right? It's received a lot of attention, but some people is like, this is completely, not good for all of these other reasons, and other people say it's good for all of these other reasons. But one thing that's sometimes misunderstood is that I think the folks behind this, let's say the developers or the architects involved, and then the buildings are bad or evil or something like, And I think the way in which I am financialized and the way in which I am personally implicated and also part of the problem is translated into the reality, which is that I love, 432 Park, I think, is a masterpiece. And I don't think Ian Gillespie is some evil person. I think it's very, very complex.
Oh, yes, I know that.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't. But well, certainly not for these kind of edifices. This is in a way a product of finance capitalism, but I hope at the same time it is also an opening to other conversations and ways forward about
So
it.
Matt, our next bottle of wine will be dedicated to the next project, the prospect.
Sounds good.
Make footnote, shop architects are exploring this site 80 corners from Vancouver Art Gallery, or me in Robson.
All right.
Another big site, and you heard it here, folks. First, watch out for the exclamation mark, which will then turn Robson Square into the period.
There we go. Thanks, Trevor. Thank you to my dear frenemy, Trevor.
I think one more person who's keen to take it.
Thanks a lot, Matthew,
for this wonderful presentation. I really don't have anything like grants to say after Trevor. I'm just maybe more impressed by this work than he is. But I have just a quick question as an architect that kind of boggles me. Maybe it's something that you might want to explore beyond this book. So now, okay, you have the statement that finance capitalism is transforming architecture from an illiquid asset, which Marx would say has use value and is tied to locale, into something that has pure exchange value, like a purest possible commodity. And this is a very powerful argument. What I would like to know here is whether you have any speculation, how does this architectural choice happen here? Let's say I'm a developer. How do I decide whether I'm going to build a Bilbao, a super podium, an exurban mat, or a legal tower? Like, is this choice contingent on the financial mechanisms that underlay the entire process of building? And if so, which are financial mechanisms gravitate to which this form? Or is this like a random aesthetic choice? Or does it purely depend on the site? Like, there is like an element of choice here between these types. But do you have any speculation about how you decide? Is that?
Yeah. Thanks, Tiana. I think how I would answer this is that, tonight and in the book, I spend all the time discussing these financial practice logics. Right? But of course, these financial practice logics coexist with interrelated decision-making criteria and cultural practices, right? So it's not to say that finance capitalism eclipses other criteria or other practices in entirety, right? Of course. So I think the result in why an exurban mat happens somewhere versus a point tower somewhere else is informed by the continued presence of a whole host of factors which are related to what are historical momentums in any given place, what are the kind of idiosyncratic kind of biographies of the people involved. So this kind of move on the spectrum is a relative move that doesn't erase all of these things. So developer X might have a history of working with certain people in a certain way, and the city planning regime has a tendency to favor this type of work because of X, Y, and Z, and then that meets and coexists with the financial imperative. And the financial imperative finds avatars that are indeed contingent on local idiosyncratic specificity. So it's not, so this move towards away from all real estate is local isn't the absolute absence of locality. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I would love if you proved that certain financial mechanisms are directly related to a formal type. That would be completely the craziest possible version of your book.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm very satisfied with the answer.
Thanks, Tiana.
Thank you, everyone. Wow, fascinating. Thanks for coming out. I think we have some books. Have a great evening and drive safe.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna, if anyone wants, I'm happy to sign books for you if you want.
Yeah.